Civil War photographs. In the mid-19th century, the biggest issue that faced this country was whether it would remain half slave and half free. Many Northerners wanted to abolish slavery altogether. White Southerners wanted to preserve slavery in their states and extend it into the territories to the west that had not yet become states. A series of incidents in the 1850s heightened the tension between North and South. Northern abolitionists were particularly incensed by the stronger Fugitive Slave Act enacted. It was part of the Compromise of 1850. It denied alleged fugitives from slavery the right to trial by jury, did not allow them to testify at their own trials, permitted their return to slavery mostly on the testimony of a claimant, and enabled court-appointed commissioners to collect $10 if they ruled for the slaveholder, and only $5 if they ruled for the fugitive instead. The law compelled those opposed to slavery in the North to turn in runaway slaves against their will. In 1852, another controversial issue was the publication of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. 300,000 copies were sold that year, and 1.2 million by the summer of 1853. Stage dramatizations reached perhaps 50 times as many people as the novel did. It pushed many waverers towards a more aggressive anti-slavery stance and incensed the South. In 1858, the country moved ever closer to disunion. Two politicians from Illinois attracted the attention of the nation. From August until October, Stephen Douglas battled Abraham Lincoln in 9 face-to-face debates around the state. The prize they sought was a seat in the U.S. Senate. Lincoln challenged Douglas to a war of ideas. Douglas took the challenge. The debates were to be held at 7 locations throughout Illinois. The fight was on, and the nation was watching. During the debates, Douglas maintained the right of the citizens of a territory to permit or prohibit slavery. It was, he said, a sacred right of self-government. Lincoln disagreed. Lincoln felt that African Americans were entitled to the rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, which include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Douglas argued that the founders intended no such inclusion for blacks. Abraham Lincoln lost to Douglas and returned Douglas to Washington. But the nation saw a rising star in the defeated Lincoln, and the South would not forget Lincoln's stand on slavery when he ran for president in 1860. In October of 1859, John Brown seized the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, with the assistance of 18 heavily armed followers, both African American and white. Their purpose was to arm a slave rebellion and create a black state within the South. Local militia and U.S. Marines, under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee, quickly reclaimed the arsenal. Brown was captured, and 10 of his party were killed. A Virginia court sentenced Brown to death. Abolitionists hailed him almost as a saint. Here's a map of the United States in 1860. There was an equal number of slave and free states at this point, which meant that the U.S. Senate was equally divided between representatives from the North and representatives from the South. But a large chunk of the western part of the country was still in territories that hadn't yet been admitted to statehood. Would slavery be permitted in these areas or not? Who would decide? It appeared that whichever party won the presidential election of 1860 would be in a position to perhaps make that decision. Four candidates ran for president in 1860. a number of aging politicians and distinguished citizens, calling themselves the Constitutional Union Party, nominated John Bell of Tennessee, a wealthy slaveholder, as their candidate for president. These people were for moderation. They decided that the best way out of the present difficulties that faced the nation was to take no stand at all on the issues that divided North and South. And Bell came in last in the election. The Democratic Party split over the issue of slavery. The Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas, who wanted to let the people in the territories decide for themselves whether to permit slavery or not. He came in third. The Southern Democrats nominated John Breckinridge, who called for federal protection of slavery and its extension into new territories, and he came in second. As the candidate of the newly formed Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln believed that the U.S. Constitution did not allow slavery, and that therefore these territories should automatically be free. Southern states worried that if the balance in Congress shifted towards more free than slave states, then Congress would abolish slavery altogether, including the Southern states that depended upon slavery for their economic livelihood. And to their horror, Lincoln was elected president. We'll turn away from reviewing the events of the period for a minute to look at some photographs. This is Matthew Brady's first photograph of Abraham Lincoln, and it was taken on the day that Lincoln gave a very important speech at Cooper Union in New York City. Over the following weeks, newspapers and magazines gave full accounts of the event, noting the high spirits of the crowd and the stirring rhetoric of the speaker. Artists for Harper's Weekly converted Brady's photograph into a full-page woodcut portrait to illustrate their story of Lincoln's triumph, and in October of 1860, Leslie's Weekly used the same image to illustrate a story about the election. Brady himself sold many photographs of the Illinois politician who had captured the eye of the nation. Brady remembered afterwards that he drew Lincoln's collar up high to improve his appearance. Subsequent versions of this famous portrait also show that artists smoothed Lincoln's hair, smoothed his facial features, and straightened his so-called roving left eye, much as photographs today are touched up. After Lincoln secured the Republican nomination in the presidency, he gave credit to his Cooper Union speech and to this portrait, saying, "Brady and the Cooper Union made me president." While we're on the subject of Lincoln photographs, you might be interested in seeing these before and after shots of Lincoln. The first was taken just after the election, and the second was taken before Lincoln's inauguration. An 11-year-old girl wrote to Lincoln during the 1860 campaign asking, quote, "Let your whiskers grow. You would look a great deal better, for your face is so thin. All the ladies like whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you, and then you would be president," unquote. Lincoln wrote back, "As to the whiskers, have never worn any. Do you not think people would call it a silly affectation if I were to begin it now?" Regardless, the next time he visited his barber, he announced, "Billy, let's give them a try to grow." By the time he began his inaugural journey by train from Illinois to Washington, D.C., he had a full beard. Here's a photograph of the inauguration, which was held on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, which was then undergoing substantial expansion that would continue throughout the war. Since the election had been won by Lincoln, of the anti-slavery Republican Party, the southern slaveholding states decided to secede from the Union altogether. 23 days after the November election, South Carolina had withdrawn from the Union, followed by the other states of the Deep South. They formed the Confederate States of America in February, a month before Lincoln's inauguration. By April, 4 states in the Upper South had also seceded. On April 11th, 1861, messengers from Lincoln informed the commander of the Federal outpost in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, that he planned to keep the fort and to resupply the soldiers stationed there. The newly formed government of the Confederate States demanded the fort's surrender. Major Robert Anderson, Fort Sumter's commander, refused to do so. The Confederates opened fire on the fort. Major Anderson ordered his men to return fire. This exchange of fire continued throughout the day and into the next morning, when the Federal forces surrendered. "The last act in the drama of Fort Sumter has been concluded," read a newspaper report. "Major Anderson has evacuated, and with his command departed by steamer from the harbor. He saluted his flag, and the company, then forming on the parade ground, marched out upon the wharf with drum and fife playing Yankee Doodle." The curtain had come down on Fort Sumter, but the drama of the American Civil War was just beginning. The photograph that you see here shows Confederate troops after they had taken possession of the fort. Here's a lithograph print of the attack on Fort Sumter, circulated by the famous printmaking firm of Currier and Ives. It's considerably more dramatic than the photograph of the fort you just saw. It's in color, it shows action, neither of which were possible with the photographic technology of the day. Lincoln called for troops to put down the Confederate insurrection, and many young men volunteered for a war that they expected would last only a few weeks. There was also a groundswell of popular support for the Confederacy. So many men volunteered for the Army that the Confederate government could not arm them all. Young men often went to local photographic studios in their brand new uniforms to have their pictures taken before they left for war. The first major battle of the war only increased Southern self-confidence. This was the Battle of Bull Run on July 21, 1861. The Confederate troops won decisively, and the Union troops fled back to Washington in disarray. This shocked Northern congressmen and spectators who had been watching the battle from a point 2 miles away. Many feared that the Confederates would pursue the Northern soldiers right into Washington and take the capital, which didn't happen. It was beginning to become clear that this war would not be over as quickly as most had anticipated. Again, notice how much more dramatic the print of the battle is than the photograph that was taken on the spot. The Civil War was the first U.S. war to be photographed, and there were a number of photographers who covered the war, especially on the northern side. Southern photographers were hampered by the fact that the North successfully blockaded southern ports, which made it difficult for operatives to acquire enough photographic chemicals and other supplies to cover the war adequately. While we don't have a count of the number of photographers who were working behind Confederate lines, at one time or another more than 300 civilian photographers covered the action of the Army of the Potomac in the North alone, and this doesn't include those who were working with other Union armies. Matthew Brady is the photographer most often associated with Civil War photographs. He arrived in New York City at the age of 16. He worked as a department store clerk, started his own small business manufacturing jewelry cases, and then learned the new daguerreotype process. By 1844, he had his own daguerreotype studio on New York's Broadway. He acquired a reputation as one of America's greatest photographers, a producer of portraits of the famous. And in 1858, he opened Brady's National Photographic Art Gallery in Washington, D.C. The city provided him with access to the nation's leaders and foreign dignitaries. As he himself said, "From the first, I regarded myself as under obligation to my country to preserve the faces of its historic men and mothers." He became one of the first photographers to use photography to chronicle national history. In 1861, when the Civil War began, He was at the pinnacle of his career, a wealthy man with a thriving business. When the war started, he became the most famous photographer covering the war. He was one of the first to have the courage and the initiative to think of moving a miniature studio out into the combat area. Planning to document the war on a grand scale, he organized a corps of photographers to follow the troops into the field. Friends tried to discourage him, citing battlefield dangers and financial risks, but he persisted. He later said, "I felt I had to go. A spirit in my feet said, 'Go,' and I went." Mathew Brady did not actually take many of the Civil War photographs attributed to him. He was more of a project manager, and he spent most of his time supervising his traveling photographers, preserving their negatives, and buying others from private photographers fresh from the battlefield, so that his collection would be as comprehensive as possible. When photographs from his collection were published, whether they were printed by Brady or adapted as engravings in publications, they were credited with Brady's name. They were shown as a photograph by Brady or a negative by Brady, New York, although they were actually the work of many different people. Two of the most famous of Brady's photographers were Alexander Gardner, whom you see on the left, and Timothy O'Sullivan, whom you see on the right. By 1861, when the war began, daguerreotypes had been replaced by the wet plate process, which required a number of steps to coat the glass plate negative, transfer the glass plate to the camera, expose the picture, and then develop the negative with more chemicals directly afterwards. Horses and wagons specially designed for field work were purchased for the traveling darkrooms, which had built-in receptacles and shelves for the chemicals and plates to guard against breakage, with additional compartments for the several types of cameras that were carried. These cameras were of different sizes, ranging from the large 16 by 20 inch type to the small 4 by 4 inch stereoscopic camera that was used to make pictures for the popular Parlor stereoscope viewer. Chemical tanks for each camera were also a part of the unit, and each darkroom wagon had a full supply of glass plates, plate holders, heavy negative boxes, and several tripods. These wagon contraptions became known as what's-it wagons because you couldn't see inside, and soldiers reportedly said "what's it" when they saw them. There were problems with these wagons, though. An exploding shell could make the horse bolt, tipping over the wagon and smashing equipment. Also, it was awkward to stoop over in the darkness of the cramped wagon, dipping sheets of glass into a tank in a crudely light-proofed developing chamber perched on the wagon's back step. There were many mishaps, and glass plates were damaged or broken more times than the Civil War photographers probably could count. Here's a photo of Sam Cooley's darkroom wagon. Cooley, who was born and raised in Hartford, Connecticut, had relocated in Beaufort, South Carolina by the time of the Civil War. In 1863, he had a photographic studio located next door to the arsenal. He sold his photographic business in May of 1864 with the intent of returning to the North, but by 1865 he was billing himself the U.S. Photographer Department of the South and selling his wartime photographs. He's one of the few Southern photographers whom we know much about. How were Civil War photographs seen by the public, since the technology didn't yet exist for reproducing photos in newspapers and magazines? One way was to view the photos from recent battles in a photographic gallery, such as Mathew Brady's galleries in New York and Washington, D.C. However, most Americans at this time didn't live in big cities and therefore didn't have access to galleries. Americans were more likely to see pictures of Civil War scenes in illustrated magazines, such as Harper's Weekly. These pictures were artist drawings based upon photographs. Here's another example. It's based upon a photograph that's allegedly by Brady, and it shows General Burnside and his staff. The more dramatic action scenes depicted in Harper's Weekly, however, were artists' purely imaginative portrayals of events and were not based upon photographic sources. Stereographic images of Civil War scenes were also popular. People could purchase these stereographic cards from distributors and then view Civil War scenes in 3D in their own homes. During the Civil War, photographers produced thousands of stereo views ranging from camp scenes to dead soldiers on the battlefield. Stereo cameras used a single glass plate negative to capture both images, using two separate lenses positioned to record the scene at a slightly different angle each, similar to the angles that we see objects through our two eyes. Prints from these negatives were intended to be looked at with a special viewer called a stereoscope, which you see here on the left, which created a three-dimensional 3D image. This famous stereographic shot was taken by O'Sullivan from a church steeple, so he's looking down on the scene. The officers have moved some of the church pews outside for a council of war. The scene seems quite casual, doesn't it? We see General Grant leaning over to look at a map held by another officer on the left side of the frame. Horses holding the soldiers are looking on from the back. Actual photographs were also pasted into books, which were then sold to the public. One of the most famous of these books was Gardner's photographic sketchbook of the war, and you see one of the pages here. This is one of a group of 50 Civil War photographs published as cards in Matthew Brady's album gallery. The images, mounted on backing that measured about 4.5 by 6 inches, show primarily scenes of Antietam, but there are a number of other images as well. In this particular picture, taken by Alexander Gardner, you see a dead horse on the battlefield at Antietam. Now we're going to turn our attention to the various types of Civil War photographs that were made during this war. The majority of photographs taken during the Civil War are portraits of soldiers, many made in photographic studios, such as this one here. Here are some other portraits of soldiers taken mainly in the studio, although the large one at the bottom was clearly taken in the field. These are all carte de visite photographs. The small size photo, which was a little larger than the size of today's business card, which proved to be a very popular item during the Civil War. Soldiers, friends, and family members could obtain these inexpensive photographs and send them to loved ones in small envelopes. Photographs of Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, and other celebrities of the day became an instant hit in the North. People were not only buying photographs of themselves, but also collecting photographs of celebrities, which they often displayed in special albums produced for these images, such as this page that you see here. Some were group pictures, such as this rather peculiar photo of 5 soldiers who seem to have fortified themselves with shots of whiskey prior to getting their picture taken. Here's a more typical group portrait showing soldiers at the front. Here's a photograph of a group of Union officers in front of their tent. Notice the subordinate role of the African American soldier in the left foreground. This is a somewhat similar scene, except that the officers are having what the image caption suggests is a dinner party of sorts, complete with an African American attendant to serve the white soldiers. In this photo, a group of white officers are passing the time by playing cards. Presumably the fourth member of the group has moved so that his back wouldn't be to the camera. The African American soldier bringing another bottle of perhaps beer is in motion, so he's blurred. A second African American soldier stands beside him, ready to carry out whatever instructions he is given. In this photo, we have a better sense that we're seeing a whole camp, since the picture includes several tents clustered together, not just one tent. Often the military took houses in the vicinity of a conflict to use as field headquarters, as we see here. Here we see President Lincoln conferring with General McClellan after the Battle of Antietam in 1862. Despite the fact that McClellan had the opportunity to destroy General Robert E. Lee's army, McClellan didn't do so. Therefore, from Lincoln's point of view, the battle was very disappointing, and McClellan's overall poor performance as a general would lead the president to remove him from command in early November. Nevertheless, the Confederates did leave the field first at Antietam, and therefore the North could claim the battle technically as a victory. This would give Lincoln the opening he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Two weeks after he recorded the carnage at Antietam, which we'll see later on in this presentation, Alexander Gardner returned to the battlefield to photograph the visit of Lincoln. The president made the 70-mile journey from the capital to Maryland to pay his respects to the wounded and to confer with his field generals. Gardner made about 25 photographs, mostly portraits of the strained meeting between Lincoln and General McClellan that you saw in the previous photograph, but he also made this formal field portrait of Lincoln posed with the head of the Secret Service, Allan Pinkerton, who's on the left, and another general there on the right. Pinkerton was the founder in 1850 of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, and during the war he proved to be a particularly poor gatherer of military intelligence in his advisory role as a spy for the Army. Many believe he significantly overestimated the strength of Robert E. Lee's forces before Antietam, an error that dramatically prolonged the war by contributing to McClellan's extreme caution at attacking the enemy. On July 17, 1862, President Lincoln authorized the use of African Americans in federal service. It was not until the Emancipation Proclamation, though, of January 1, 1863, that African American men could serve in combat. Soon, there were 200,000 black soldiers serving in the Union Army and Navy. These men were paid less than white soldiers, were given old and worn uniforms, in poor equipment, and could not become officers. Despite the unfair treatment, African American men volunteered to take part in the combat. Company E, 4th U.S. Colored Infantry, which you see here, was assigned to the defenses of Washington, D.C., the Union's capital. As the Civil War progressed and Union soldiers moved deeper into Virginia, enslaved African Americans began to walk away from their masters' homes, seeking protection from behind Union Army lines. At the start of the war, the Union had no policy to deal with the African Americans seeking protection. Individual commanders made their own decisions. Some commanders put African Americans to work for the Union troops, others returned them to plantation owners. Union Army officer Benjamin Butler refused to send 3 fugitives back to the bonds of slavery. He classified the escaping slaves as contraband of war. This term meant that once the fleeing slaves crossed Union Army lines, they were classified as property. All enemy property that fell into Union hands constituted contraband and would not be returned. Finally, on August 6, 1861, Union fugitive slaves were declared to be contraband of war if their labor had been used to aid the Confederacy in any way. And if found to be contraband, they were declared to be free. Here are 3 Confederate prisoners, posing somewhat defiantly after the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. Most of the photos we have of war prisoners taken during the war were shot by photographers covering the Union Army, so we're seeing mainly Confederates in these pictures. Those photos we do have of Union prisoners of war who had been captured by the Confederates are pictures taken after they had been released. This photo was taken by an Army surgeon at the U.S. General Hospital in Annapolis, Maryland, where the soldier was brought for treatment. The photograph that you just saw and others that were taken at the same time were reproduced as drawings and published in Harper's Weekly. The grim illustrations so incensed the nation that the commander of the rebel prison was the only Southern officer to be executed after the war ended. Another type of Civil War photograph besides portraits would be the logistical pictures that were taken for the military, showing railway lines, the terrain around probable battle sites, pontoon bridges erected by the Army to replace destroyed bridges, etc. This is the bridge on the Orange and Alexandria Railway in Virginia, as repaired by Army engineers. This photograph was taken during the siege at Petersburg that took place from June of 1864 to April of 1865. You can see the photographic wagon of the engineering department in the the right foreground, and I've enlarged it down below the stereograph image that you've got above. What about battles? We would expect to see lots of photographs of action during the war, but of course that was impossible, given the limitations of photographic equipment at this time. The exposure time was too long to enable photographers to capture movement. Notice the officer on the horse on the right side of this photograph. He's moving and therefore his image is blurred. Also, the weapons of the day emitted so much smoke when they were fired that the battlefield was soon enveloped in smoke, and any photographs that were taken would have been quite murky. Finally, photographers weren't allowed upon the battlefield until after hostilities had ended, so they weren't there to witness and record the action very often. This photograph of the artillery in action, taken actually before any firing had begun, is about as close to a Civil War action shot as we have. Here's another photograph of about the same scene, apparently taken from the opposite direction. A better title for this photograph, one suspects, would have been Artillery in Pretend Action. Obviously, artists had no such limitations as did photographers, and they produced fanciful, dramatic pictures of soldiers charging boldly and bravely into action, and scenes that had little correspondence to reality. Here's another. Note the use of color, which was also not possible in the photographs of the day. The printmaking firm of Currier and Ives produced some of the most iconic and popular American art of the 19th century. Based in New York City from the 1830s to 1907, This company specialized in publishing hand-colored lithographic prints that were sold inexpensively to the growing American middle class. It advertised its lithographs as, quote, colored engravings for the people, unquote. Here is a Currier and Ives print that was widely circulated of a Civil War battle. As usual, the illustration possesses the color, the action, the drama that the photographs of the Civil War couldn't hope to duplicate. Some Civil War photographs focused on wounded soldiers, and sometimes of the attempts to treat the wounded. Here an ambulance crew appears to be loading wounded men into a first aid wagon after a battle. In actual fact, a photograph couldn't capture the motion that would have been required to carry out this task, so we have to conclude that the scene was posed. As the caption notes, this was a demonstration rather than the real thing. Wounded soldiers were often brought to temporary field hospitals after battle, and we see a typical field hospital here. This one near the scene of the Battle of Savage's Station in Virginia in the early summer of 1862. Given the fact that the wounded weren't moving that much, photographers had a relatively easy time capturing scenes such as this one. In this photograph, an Army surgeon is about to operate on a wounded man. All too often, doctors were forced to amputate arms or legs into which bullets had penetrated. There were no antiseptics in those days, and infection frequently led to gangrene. Amputation was then the only way to try to save the man's life. Eventually, those severely wounded soldiers who had survived long enough were evacuated to proper hospital facilities, such as this one in Washington, D.C. Here we see patients in Ward K, Armory Square Hospital, in August of 1865, just after the war had ended. While Civil War photographers couldn't record action scenes, they could certainly capture images of death. Because the photographers typically couldn't access a battlefield until a day or more after the conflict, they encountered a situation in which the bodies had lain in the sun long enough to begin to decompose. The situation was worse in the summertime, as was the case when O'Sullivan took these pictures after Gettysburg. The Union Army had buried their own dead first, so that the bodies still lying on the battlefield were usually those of Confederate forces. When these photographs and others like them began to be exhibited in Washington and New York, the public was shocked. Battlefield was nothing like the glorious affair depicted in contemporary paintings and illustrations. This famous photograph was taken by Alexander Gardner at Gettysburg. Since it's discussed at length elsewhere in your readings and the video, I think, I'm not going to be talking about it here. The photographer who took this picture has brought his camera much closer to the body than is usual in Civil War photographs. We can see the man's face quite clearly. This would not be the case for photographs of slain American soldiers in future wars, perhaps because the later images would be more widely distributed in the media, and publishers didn't want relatives to open their morning newspapers and see such a stark image of their loved ones. Here's another photograph of a fallen soldier, presenting him in a rather ignominious situation. He seems little more than a crumpled heap of clothing. This Currier and Ives print of a battle shows what seems to be a dead or dying soldier on the bottom left. The soldier in the Currier and Ives print dies gracefully, in stark contrast to the dead rebel soldier in Gardner's photograph. Soldiers' bodies were often stacked together prior to burial. This image suggests that handling the dead had become almost mechanized. These corpses seem almost like cordwood rather than people's bodies. Note again that the bodies seem to be almost bursting at the seams of the uniform as they became bloated in the heat of the summer sun. Sometimes armies moved on before they had had a chance to bury all of the dead. In some cases, they came back in the same direction later on. It usually fell to African American soldiers or civilian workers to gather the skeletons and bury them. This photograph of a burial detail at Cold Harbor, Virginia, is one of those included in Gardner's photographic sketchbook. Some soldiers, usually officers, whose families had the financial means to pay to have them transported back to their hometowns, were embalmed prior to shipment. Here's an embalmer who has set up shop near a battlefield. Like dead bodies, buildings don't move. Photographers often recorded the destruction to towns and cities along the war's path. This photograph shows Richmond, Virginia, after the Union Army had finally captured the city and after the Confederate government and military had fled. Not all of the destruction was the result of Yankee bombardment. The rebels set the city afire as they retreated, not wanting the victors to take control of an intact city. Here's another view of the destruction at Richmond. This picture is an illustration that was published in Harper's Weekly and is based upon, or loosely based upon, a photograph taken by Alexander Gardner of this scene. It shows the Grand Review in Washington, D.C. as the victorious army passes by the principal stand. And so here's the army coming back in victory and marking the end of the war, I think, even more effectively than the final surrender of the Confederates at Appomattox a month before, which was not seen by nearly as many people as this.